Hi, I'm Tiffany. I am currently based at the New Economics Foundation in London, and my chapter is the 7th chapter in the book, and it's called Cycling London, an Intersectional Feminist Perspective. And since I wrote this chapter like 4 years ago, there have been lots of interesting applications, just in terms of the work I've been doing in Latin America and in London over the past year, just a lot more interest in intersectionality and cycling. So I'll just start with this figure that was my starting point into my research, that 73% of cycling journeys in London are made by men. And this figure has remained more or less constant over the past decade and a half, despite unprecedented levels of investment in cycling infrastructure. And this 73% statistic is relatively stable across English-speaking low cycling contexts. So that's not just the UK, but the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And it's emerging in some parts of Western Europe, like Spain and France. So for every female cyclist, there are 3 to 4 male cyclists on the road. And Tanu and others have covered some of these issues already, but some of the ways in which mobility is gendered include sexual harassment and gender-based violence, gendered perceptions of safety, the gender pay gap and employment discrimination, occupational segregation in the labor market, and the gender division of household labor and care work. And these are just some examples of structural factors that create gender differences in the ways in which people travel in urban space. So I'm going to talk about intersectionality, then go over how that applies to infrastructure, safety, representation, and I'll conclude with recommendations. So I foreground my work with an intersectional perspective, which I define as an understanding that there are multiple aspects of identity, such as sex, sexual orientation, race, religion, age, and physical ability or disability, that interact in complex ways to shape how people experience the world. An intersectional perspective also acknowledges that there are multiple kinds of discrimination and inequalities that are interconnected and therefore cannot be analyzed separately. How it applies to urban mobility: as we pass through spaces like streets, we experience multiple kinds of security and insecurity due to social attitudes towards race, gender, class, age, ability, and modes of transportation, for example. So the key question about infrastructure is infrastructure for whom and for what? One of my main critiques of London's approach to cycling policy and infrastructure, which I think isn't unique to London, it's quite common, is there's a predominantly technocratic framing, meaning it's led by a viewpoint that heavily favors quantitative data and emphasizes science, technology, engineering, and economics. And when you frame cycling and urban mobility and even urban planning in a very technocratic way, it just makes it really difficult to make issues around gender, diversity, and social inclusion seem relevant because they're not scientific or technological or engineering, economics related. So the Mayor's vision for cycling in London was London's first cycling policy document, put out in like 2012 by the former Mayor Boris Johnson. And in this vision for cycling, superhighways and quiet ways are kind of foregrounding this document. Those are the two types of material infrastructure that the city will prioritize building. And as you can see on these provisional maps, the cycle superhighways and the quiet ways both facilitate radial journeys from the outskirts of the center into the city. And we know that radial planning reflects an implicit male bias because it's premised on the idea of the male breadwinner who lives out in the suburbs and commutes into the city center for work, then just goes back home to the suburbs at the end of the day. We know that men tend to make more work and work-related trips during peak hours compared to women, and women tend to make more frequent short-distance journeys throughout the day compared to men, and women also do more trip training than men do, so the radio planning of cycling infrastructure disproportionately benefits men at the expense of women. And when we look at the employment stats of Londoners, women make up 51% of London's population, but only 61% are economically active compared to 74% of men. And of the 61% of London women who are economically active, only 65% are in full-time employment, whereas 82% of men are. So again, this calls into question radio planning because the way people work is different. There are clear gender differences, not only in terms of tenure, like full-time versus part-time, but also gender pay gap and occupational segregation. It impacts where people travel to get to work. And gender aside, when we look at ethnicity and age, we see that Black, Asian, and minority ethnic Londoners are the fastest growing population in the city, and most of them are under the age of 49, which underscores the need for their transport needs to be met. And there's a growing body of literature in the US that critiques socioeconomic and racial inequalities in cycling infrastructure investments. For instance, Melody Hoffman and Adonia Lugo have pioneered the argument that a lot of US cities and arguably Western European cities as well use cycling infrastructure as a creative class carrot to try and attract more affluent, more white, more well-educated residents while pushing out less desirable communities of color, lower income groups. And over the summer, there was the first study of New York's cycle hire scheme, the City Bike Network bike sharing scheme. And I think there's been a lot of intuitive and anecdotal evidence that it disproportionately serves wealthier white people. But here is the first study with empirical evidence that City Bike disproportionately serves the wealthiest and most privileged parts of New York. Not only are these parts of the city more white and affluent than other parts, but they also have very good public transport access already. So it's leaving out people for whom cycling is a spatial or economic necessity. And looking at London, there's been no such study so far, but the Boris bike stations, the bike share scheme in London, they're all clustered within zones 1 and 2, just the central area. So again, we see vast inequalities in the spatial distribution of bike share, like Tony was saying earlier. And now I will move on and talk about safety and how safety is gendered, raced, and classed. So we know that road safety is gendered. There's evidence that female cyclists are, well, in the US at least, 4 times more likely to be closely passed by drivers compared to male cyclists. And in the UK, there's a 2015 near-miss study which showed that although near misses are an everyday experience for people cycling in the UK, women experience significantly higher rates of near misses than men do, and female cyclists are twice as likely to be abused and harassed on roads by drivers than men are. There's emerging discussion about sexual harassment while cycling and how in an informal poll that Streets Blog New York did of women cycling in New York, women overwhelmingly reported that sexual harassment on their bikes was a daily experience when they were cycling. And again, transport planners typically only consider safety from the perspective of safety from cars and traffic, but we need to consider sexual harassment as well. We also need to consider racial profiling as a barrier to cycling. So in the US, there's evidence that fear of racial profiling by the police is a top barrier to cycling for Black and Hispanic men. And this isn't based on nothing. 1 in 5 Black and Hispanic men in the US report having been unfairly stopped by the police, and this makes them more wary of cycling because they want to avoid police interactions. They want to minimize their visibility. And in the UK, we also see racial disparities in stop and search, which is up by 32% in England and Wales. And again, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people are over 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched compared to white people. And specifically, Black or Black British people are about 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. And there's a growing body of just anecdotal evidence that Black cyclists are disproportionately stopped by police for smelling like cannabis or just not being where they should be on the road. So very clear racial profiling that's impacting cycling and people's choice to cycle or not. In Latin America, there's growing scrutiny of on-demand apps like Glovo, Rappi, Uber Eats, those type of like delivery type of cycling delivery apps where a lot of the cyclists are often immigrants, and it's kind of the intersection of precarious labor, precarious streets, and even precarious immigration status. And there's research from the US in San Francisco where a lot of immigrants have become wary of or afraid to cycle or to use the bike sharing scheme because they're afraid of sharing their data. They don't want to make themselves more visible and have their data out there. And I just want to highlight Buenos Aires in Argentina, which was the first city to take legal action against these delivery apps after they saw a spike in road traffic incidents concerning drivers and delivery cyclists, in which the apps were always very hands-off and just saying, these aren't our employees. What happens to them when they're out on the roads isn't our responsibility. So I think this case is still developing, but it might set a precedent for other cities across the world. And finally, I will go into representation. Who is the cyclist that we are designing cycling infrastructure for? So in London, the 2 predominant stereotypes of cyclists are mammals and hipsters. And you see this reflected in the mayor's vision for cycling in London, in which mammals and hipsters are referred to repeatedly. And it might seem funny and lighthearted, but this is really problematic because these 2 stereotypes represent cyclists as fit, presumably middle-class, able-bodied white men, and 85% of cyclists in London are white. 49% of people in London say that cycling isn't for people like me. So again, representations of cyclists and cycling impact whether people think people like me can cycle, or whether it really is feasible for people like me. So finally, some recommendations. I think the 2 key things that have to happen simultaneously are to diversify from within the profession or the built environment sector more broadly, and adopt an intersectional perspective so that there is gender expertise. There are also some more practical ways to do that, such as gender budgeting or gender safety audits, just to make gender very explicit as a category for consideration, along with race, class, sexuality, things like that. A second recommendation is change the narrative. So it's interesting because I've been working with Mexico City and Bogota over the past 9 months to improve diversity and inclusion in cycling. And what's really interesting about cycling discourses from activists and policymakers and even planners and professionals in Latin America is it's not about cycling, it's not about health, it's not about the environment or the climate emergency, it's about the right to the city and the right to appropriate urban space and just claiming space that isn't there for you because of cars or inequality. And I think this rhetoric around the right to the city needs to be more prominent in European and North American discourses about cycling that are predominantly framed around the climate emergency or public health, sustainability. Equally, I think in Latin American contexts, these discourses around public health and sustainability and the climate emergency could be more prominent, but I think the right to the city just seems a lot more expansive. It includes and isn't limited to just cycling, and it's less polarizing than just talking about whether we should have more cycling infrastructure or not. And the city of Bogota was the first that I knew of to adopt an urban policy goal of more women on bicycles. So in September, they had the first 50-50 More Women on Bicycles Congress, and the local government was working very closely with activist groups and really amplifying the voices of activists that are already doing the groundwork to try and diversify cycling and support more inclusive cycling. And what I thought was really cool about their campaign to advertise the 50-50 Congress as like an event, and also that it's a public policy goal, was that throughout the city, in parks, plazas, like by libraries, there were just different images of diverse women cycling with like a small blurb about why they cycle or what they're doing. So in this one, it says the bicycle empowers us, and these are just women from different activist cycling groups in Bogota. So yeah, in terms of more concrete actions, I would recommend collecting gender disaggregated data just so we have a clearer and more realistic picture of who's making what types of journeys and when. Conduct gender safety audits so that gendered perceptions of safety enter into how we plan infrastructure. Invest in high-quality orbital and radial cycling routes that function as a joined-up network, because we can't continue with radio planning as is, with the male bias and the ways in which it doesn't really reflect how the labor market is changing, the ways in which we work are changing. And finally, strengthen and support social infrastructure. So like what Bogota did when the local government highlighted the important work of all these grassroots groups and just showcased them through their campaign and the images throughout the city. And I just want to end with the Jane Jacobs quote that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. And I think that's really important to keep in mind when we think and talk about inclusive cycling. Thank you.